Most people think the strangest mysteries of the Bible happen at the end of the story. The beasts of Revelation, the visions of Daniel, the apocalyptic warnings about the final days. But one of the most unsettling mysteries in the entire Bible appears near the very beginning, only a few pages after creation, hidden in a passage so short that many readers barely notice it. 4 verses, that's all it takes. 4 verses that raise questions scholars have debated for thousands of years. Because the text seems to describe a moment when something crossed the boundary between heaven and earth. Genesis chapter 6 begins quietly. Humanity is multiplying, families are growing, the world is filling with people, and then suddenly the narrative turns. The text says something. The strange passage appears in Genesis chapter 6. It is short, almost abrupt. Just a few lines placed between the early stories of humanity and the coming of the flood. But those few lines have unsettled readers for centuries. The text begins simply enough. Human beings are multiplying across the earth. Families are growing. Civilization is beginning to spread. And then the narrative shifts. Genesis says something unexpected. It says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took them as wives. The wording is calm, almost casual. But what follows is anything but ordinary. The next line introduces a word that has echoed through history: Nephilim. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The passage calls them mighty men of old, men of renown, warriors, figures of legend. But the text never clearly explains who they were or where they came from. And that silence has created one of the most enduring mysteries in biblical history. Because the passage raises 3 unsettling questions. First, who exactly were the sons of God? Second, why would their union with human women produce giants? And third, why does this strange event appear immediately before the story of the flood? The Bible almost seems to place the 2 events side by side, as if one led to the other, as if something about this union between the sons of God and human women changed the world in a way that could not be undone. For many readers, the first instinct is to assume the phrase "sons of God" simply refers to powerful human rulers, ancient kings, warriors, nobles who use their power to take wives from among the population. It sounds reasonable. But when we look closer at the language of the Bible, a problem begins to appear, because the phrase "sons of God" is not used very often. But when it does appear, it almost always means something very different, something that does not belong to the human world at all, which means the mystery of Genesis 6 might not be about human corruption alone. It might be hinting at something much larger, something that involves the unseen world, a world that the Bible occasionally reveals, but rarely explains in detail. A world populated by beings who existed long before humanity, beings the Bible sometimes calls angels, sometimes messengers, and sometimes the sons of God. If that is what the phrase means here, then Genesis 6 is describing something extraordinary, a moment when spiritual beings entered the human story in a way they were never meant to, a moment when the boundaries between heaven and earth became dangerously thin. But before we can even consider that possibility, we have to look carefully at how the Bible itself uses the phrase, because the answer to the mystery may already be hidden in other passages of Scripture. Passages that quietly reveal who the sons of God might be. And once we examine those clues, the story of Genesis 6 begins to look very different. Different enough to make us wonder whether the early chapters of the Bible are describing something far stranger than we have ever imagined. And that discovery begins in a book most people would never expect, the book of Job. To understand the mystery of the sons of God, we have to step outside Genesis for a moment. Because the Bible does something unusual. It uses the same phrase in other books, and those passages quietly reveal a pattern. One of the clearest examples appears in the book of Job. At the beginning of that story, we are taken into a scene that feels almost cinematic, a gathering in heaven, a moment when beings from the spiritual world appear before God. The text describes it like this: one day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Then something unexpected happens. Another figure appears among them, Satan, the adversary, the accuser. The text does not introduce him dramatically. He simply stands among the others, which tells us something important. In this passage, the sons of God are clearly not human beings. They are part of a heavenly assembly, a divine council, a gathering of spiritual beings who exist in the presence of God. This scene appears again later in the same book, in Job chapter 38. God is speaking, and he asks Job a series of questions about the creation of the world, questions that no human could answer. And in the middle of that speech, God describes a moment at the dawn of creation. He says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" Pause for a moment. Think about what that verse implies. The sons of God were present before humanity existed. They witnessed the creation of the earth. They celebrated it, which means the phrase sons of God in these passages clearly refers to heavenly beings, not kings, not tribes, not human rulers, but members of the spiritual world. And once we recognize that pattern, the language in Genesis begins to look very different, because Genesis uses the same phrase, the same wording, the same expression, the sons of God. And that raises a difficult question. If the Bible consistently uses this phrase to describe heavenly beings, why would Genesis suddenly use it to describe human rulers? The shift would be strange, almost unnatural, especially in a text where words are chosen very carefully. This is why many ancient readers reached a very different conclusion. Jewish interpreters writing centuries before the time of Christ believed the sons of God were angels, not faithful angels, but rebellious ones, beings who abandoned their place in the spiritual realm and descended into the human world. In their view, Genesis 6 was describing a moment when certain angels crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed, a boundary between heaven and earth, a boundary between the spiritual and the physical. And the result of that crossing was something unprecedented. Children who were neither fully human nor fully divine. The Nephilim, giants, warriors, men whose strength and violence became legendary. But if that interpretation is even partially true, it raises a troubling possibility, because it suggests that the early world described in Genesis was not only shaped by human decisions, it was influenced by a rebellion that began in the spiritual realm itself, a rebellion that spilled over into human history. And if that happened, then Genesis 6 is not just a strange story about ancient giants, it is the opening chapter of a cosmic conflict, one that was already unfolding long before the floodwaters began to rise. And that leads us to the first real paradox in this mystery. Because if the sons of God were truly heavenly beings, then Genesis may be describing something that challenges everything we think we know about the early history of the world. Now the mystery deepens, because if the phrase sons of God refers to heavenly beings in other parts of the Bible, then Genesis chapter 6 seems to be describing something extraordinary, something that challenges the way most people imagine the early world. Think about the implication for a moment. If the sons of God were spiritual beings, then Genesis is describing a moment when the unseen world stepped directly into human history, a moment when the boundary between heaven and earth was crossed. But this idea raises an immediate problem, because throughout the Bible, angels are described as spiritual beings, messengers, servants of God, creatures who belong to the heavenly realm. They appear in visions, they deliver messages, they guide and warn, and sometimes protect. But they are never described as forming families. They are never described as having children. In fact, in the New Testament, Jesus himself says something intriguing about angels. When speaking about life after resurrection, he says that humans will be like the angels in heaven, not marrying, not reproducing, existing in a different order of life altogether. So if angels do not marry, how could the sons of God take human women as wives? That contradiction has led many scholars to reject the angelic interpretation entirely. Instead, they suggest another possibility. Some argue that the sons of God were powerful human rulers, ancient kings who believed they were chosen by the gods. In this interpretation, Genesis 6 is describing a time when tyrants began to dominate early society. Men with power taking any women they desired, corrupting the social order, spreading violence across the earth. This interpretation has one advantage. It avoids the supernatural problem. It keeps the story entirely within the human world. But it creates another difficulty, because the text does not say kings of the earth. It does not say sons of kings. It says something very specific, sons of God. And the Hebrew phrase used in Genesis is the same phrase that appears in Job, Beni Elohim, the sons of God, which brings us back to the paradox. If the phrase normally refers to heavenly beings, and the text uses that same phrase here, then perhaps the story is not meant to be interpreted as purely human. Perhaps the ancient readers understood something we have forgotten, because when we look at the earliest Jewish writings outside the Bible, we find that the angelic interpretation was not controversial at all. It was the standard explanation. The Book of Enoch, written centuries before the New Testament, describes a group of angels called the Watchers. According to this tradition, these beings were sent to observe humanity. But something went wrong. They saw the daughters of humans. They desired them, and they made a decision that would alter the course of the world. They descended. They took wives, and their children became giants, violent, powerful, uncontrollable. In these ancient writings, the rise of the Nephilim is not just a strange event, it is a catastrophe, a corruption of creation itself, a mixing of realms that were never meant to merge. But that raises an even deeper question. If something like this truly happened, why would Genesis describe it in only 4 verses? Why would the Bible mention such an enormous event so briefly? Almost as if the original readers already knew the story. Almost as if Genesis was referencing something that had once been widely understood. And if that is true, then the mystery of the sons of God may not begin in Genesis 6 at all. It may begin earlier, in a story about rebellion, a rebellion that began not on earth, but in heaven itself. If Genesis 6 is hinting at a rebellion that crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, then we need to ask a deeper question. Did the Bible ever describe such a rebellion? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Most people are familiar with the idea that Satan rebelled against God, a fall from heaven, a cosmic betrayal. But the Bible never tells that story in a single clear narrative. Instead, the clues are scattered across different books, fragments of a larger picture. One of the most intriguing passages appears in the book of Isaiah. It speaks of a being called the morning star, who sought to rise above the heavens, to exalt his throne, to become like the Most High. The passage describes a fall, a casting down, a being who once shone brightly, now brought low. Later Christian tradition connected this passage with the fall of Satan, but the text itself is mysterious, symbolic, open to interpretation. Another passage appears in the book of Ezekiel. It describes a guardian figure in Eden, a being adorned with precious stones, perfect in beauty, until corruption was found in him. Again, the language feels larger than the story it seems to describe, almost as if the text is pointing towards something cosmic, something that happened long before human history unfolded. And then in the New Testament, we find another intriguing reference. The book of Revelation speaks of a war in heaven, a conflict between heavenly forces, angels battling against a great dragon, and the dragon is cast down to the earth. This pattern appears again and again. Hints, fragments, moments where the Bible briefly pulls back the curtain and reveals a struggle in the spiritual realm. A rebellion, a fall, a conflict that did not remain confined to heaven. But if rebellious spiritual beings were cast down to earth, what happened next? Where did they go? What did they do? Genesis 6 may provide a clue, because the story of the sons of God appears at a very specific moment in history, right before the flood, right before the destruction of the ancient world. And the text connects these events in a subtle but powerful way. Immediately after describing the sons of God and the Nephilim, Genesis says something striking. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. Violence filled the world. Corruption spread everywhere. The earth itself had become distorted, and God decides to bring judgment. But what caused that corruption? Was it simply human sin? Or did something else accelerate the chaos? The ancient Jewish writers who preserved the Watcher's story believed the answer was clear. The rebellion of the sons of God had unleashed something dangerous. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge, weapons, sorcery, manipulation of nature, the corruption of moral order. In these traditions, the giants became tyrants, oppressors, figures whose power and brutality pushed the world toward destruction. The flood, then, was not merely punishment, it was containment, a reset, a way of restoring the boundaries that had been violated. But the Bible itself never explains all of these details. Genesis remains strangely quiet, which leaves us with an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the early readers of Genesis already knew the story behind those 4 verses, a story that had once circulated widely in the ancient world, a story about beings who descended from heaven and changed the course of human history. And if that is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly were the Nephilim? Because if the sons of God were something more than human, Their children may have been something more than human as well, and that possibility opens an entirely new chapter in the mystery. If the sons of God crossed into the human world, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What were the Nephilim? Genesis introduces them almost casually, just a single sentence. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. But that single word has echoed through centuries of debate, because the Hebrew term Nephilim is difficult to translate. Some scholars believe it comes from a root word meaning to fall, which is why some ancient interpreters translated it as the fallen ones. Others believe it refers to beings of enormous size or strength. This is why many English translations render the word simply as giants. But the Bible does not stop there. The text adds another intriguing detail. It says the Nephilim were present in those days and also afterward. Those two words are easy to overlook, and also afterward. But they raise a disturbing possibility, because if the giants existed before the flood, how could they appear afterward? Did some of them survive, or did something similar happen again? The Bible never explains, but later passages offer curious hints. When the Israelites entered the land of Canaan, they encountered people described as enormous in stature. The book of Numbers records a report from Israelite spies who explored the land. They say something remarkable. We saw the Nephilim there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. The description may sound exaggerated, but the text clearly connects these giants with the same mysterious word used in Genesis, Nephilim. And the stories do not stop there. Later books of the Old Testament mention several groups associated with unusual size and strength: the Anakim, the Rephaim, warriors described as towering figures. One of the most famous examples appears in the story of David and Goliath. Goliath is introduced as a giant, a warrior whose height and armor make him seem almost unstoppable. These stories suggest that the memory of giants persisted long after the flood, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if the Nephilim were not just mythological figures? What if they were remembered as real beings whose presence left a deep impression on ancient cultures? Interestingly, traditions about giants appear in many civilizations. Mesopotamian texts speak of enormous heroes. Greek mythology describes the Titans. Norse legends tell stories of giant races that existed before the world was reshaped. These parallels do not prove anything, but they do suggest that ancient people across different cultures preserve stories about powerful beings who lived in the distant past. Beings larger than ordinary humans. Beings associated with ancient catastrophes. And when we place those traditions alongside the brief statement in Genesis, the mystery becomes even deeper. Because the Bible never fully explains who the Nephilim were, it simply acknowledges their existence, almost as if the original readers needed no further explanation, almost as if the story behind them was already widely known. But if the giants were the children of the sons of God, then their appearance may have represented something far more serious than physical strength. It may have represented a corruption of creation itself, a blending of two worlds that were never meant to merge. And if that corruption spread across the earth, it could explain why the next event in Genesis is so dramatic. The flood, a global catastrophe that wiped away almost everything that came before. But before the waters rose, another decision had to be made. Because according to Genesis, God saw something in the world that could not be allowed to continue. Something so destructive that the only solution was to begin again. And understanding that decision may reveal the true significance of the sons of God. Because the story of the flood is not just about human wickedness, it may also be about restoring the boundaries of creation itself. By the time we reach the story of the flood, the world of Genesis has changed dramatically. Violence fills the earth, corruption spreads through human society, and the text suggests that something deeper has gone wrong, something beyond ordinary human failure. Genesis describes the situation in stark terms. The earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. But notice the wording. The corruption is not limited to individuals. It affects the entire earth, almost as if creation itself has been distorted, almost as if something fundamental in the order of the world has been altered. This is where the story of the sons of God begins to take on a new meaning. Because if the ancient interpretation is correct, if rebellious spiritual beings truly crossed into the human world, then Genesis 6 may be describing more than moral corruption. It may be describing a corruption of creation itself, a mixing of realms that were never meant to merge. Heaven and earth, spirit and flesh. Two worlds that were designed to exist in relationship, but not in union. In that sense, the story is not simply about angels and humans. It is about boundaries, the structure of creation, the idea that different forms of life occupy different domains. The Bible repeatedly emphasizes this principle. In Genesis chapter 1, God separates light from darkness, sea from land, day from night. Order emerges through separation. Boundaries create stability. But Genesis 6 describes a moment when one of those boundaries collapses. Spiritual beings entering the human realm. Human women bearing children unlike any seen before. And the result is a world that quickly spirals into violence. The ancient book of Enoch expands on this idea in vivid detail. According to that tradition, the Watchers did more than simply take wives. They taught humanity knowledge that had not been meant for them. The forging of weapons, the secrets of metals, forms of sorcery, astrology, techniques for manipulating the natural world. In other words, they accelerated human power faster than human wisdom. And the result was chaos, a world filled with violence, pride, and domination. In the story of Enoch, the giants themselves became agents of destruction, consuming resources, oppressing humanity, turning the earth into a battlefield. Whether or not one accepts these ancient traditions, they reveal how early readers understood the passage. Genesis 6 was not just about desire, it was about rebellion, a cosmic rebellion that spilled into human history. And once that corruption reached a certain point, the world became unstable. Something had to change. That change came in the form of the flood. But the flood itself raises another mystery. Because if God intended to reset the world, why preserve any part of it at all? Why save Noah and his family? Why not simply begin again from the beginning? The answer may reveal the deeper purpose of the story, because the flood was not meant to erase humanity, it was meant to preserve it, to restore the original order of creation, to protect the future of a species that had been placed at the center of the divine story. Which means the conflict described in Genesis 6 was never really about giants alone. It was about human destiny, about whether humanity would remain what it was created to be, or become something else entirely. And that deeper question still echoes through the rest of the Bible, because even after the flood, the struggle between order and corruption did not disappear. It continued, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. And the Bible hints that the unseen world remained involved in that struggle. Which leads us to the final and perhaps most important question. Why would spiritual beings be so interested in humanity in the first place? What made humans worth corrupting? The answer may lie in something that appears all the way back at the beginning of Genesis, a phrase so familiar that most readers barely notice its significance. The statement that humanity was created in the image of God. And once we understand what that phrase might mean, the entire mystery of the sons of God begins to take on a new dimension. To understand why the story of the sons of God matters, we have to return to the beginning of Genesis. Back to a phrase that appears in the first chapter of the Bible, a phrase repeated so often that it can easily lose its power. Humanity, the text says, was created in the image of God. For centuries, theologians have debated what that phrase means. Does it refer to intelligence? To moral awareness? To creativity? Perhaps all of those things. But in the ancient world, the phrase image of God carried another meaning as well. It referred to representation. In many ancient kingdoms, rulers placed statues of themselves throughout their territory. These statues were called images. They were symbols of authority. Where the image stood, the king's rule was present. In Genesis, humanity itself is described as God's image, which means human beings were meant to represent God's authority within creation, not as tyrants, but as stewards, caretakers of the world, participants in the unfolding story of creation. That idea gives humanity a unique role in the biblical universe. Angels serve God, animals inhabit the earth, but humans stand at a remarkable intersection. We belong to the physical world, yet we reflect something of the divine. In a sense, humanity occupies the meeting point between heaven and earth, and that may explain why the story of the sons of God appears in Genesis at all. Because if rebellious spiritual beings wish to disrupt God's creation, humanity would be the most strategic target, corrupt the image, distort the representatives, and the entire order of the world begins to unravel. Genesis 6 may be describing exactly that moment, a moment when the human story was pushed toward a dangerous transformation, when the boundaries of creation were challenged, and the future of humanity was suddenly uncertain. The flood becomes the turning point, a moment when God intervenes to restore balance. But the deeper story does not end there. Because the idea of humanity as God's image continues throughout the rest of Scripture, the prophets speak of a coming renewal, a restoration of what was lost. And in the New Testament, the idea takes on a new dimension. Jesus is described as the perfect image of God, the true representative of divine authority within the human world. In that sense, the Bible's narrative arc stretches from Genesis to the New Testament in a single continuous thread, from the corruption of humanity's role to its restoration. Which means the strange passage in Genesis 6 may not simply be a curious myth about giants. It may represent a crucial moment in the larger story, a moment when humanity's purpose was threatened, a moment when the world stood at the edge of chaos, and the deeper we look at that moment, the clearer one thing becomes. The story of the sons of God is not only about the past, it is about the ongoing struggle between order and corruption, faithfulness and rebellion, heaven and earth. But one piece of the puzzle still remains. Because if the flood was meant to reset the world, what happened to the legacy of the Nephilim? Did their influence truly disappear? Or did something of their story survive into the world that came after? The Bible leaves that question open, and the answer may lie in the final chapters of this mystery, chapters that connect ancient giants, forgotten civilizations, and the continuing story of humanity itself. If the flood was meant to cleanse the world, then a question naturally follows. Did it actually work? Genesis describes the flood as a complete reset. Waters covering the earth, cities erased, civilizations gone. Only Noah and his family survive. 8 people, a single family line from which humanity would begin again. At first glance, the story seems clear. The corruption that filled the ancient world was destroyed. The influence of the sons of God was removed. The giants disappeared. But then something strange happens. As the story of the Bible continues, echoes of the old world begin to appear again. When the Israelites approach the land of Canaan, the spies return with a terrifying report. They describe enormous warriors, men of intimidating size and strength, and they use a very specific word, Nephilim, the same word that appeared before the flood, the same mysterious term associated with the children of the sons of God. The spies say something remarkable. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes. Whether their fear exaggerated the situation or not, the connection is striking. It suggests that the memory of the giants did not vanish with the flood. Other passages describe similar figures. The Anakim, the Rephaim, groups remembered as unusually tall and powerful. Among them appears one of the most famous figures in biblical history, Goliath, the giant warrior who faced David. His armor alone weighed more than most soldiers could carry. His spear was described as massive, his height towering over the battlefield. But the Bible does not present Goliath as something supernatural. He is simply one of the last members of a fading line of giants, a reminder of something ancient, something that belonged to an earlier world. This pattern raises a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the flood did not erase every trace of the events described in Genesis 6. Perhaps the influence of that ancient corruption lingered in scattered places. Fragments of a forgotten past, memories preserved in stories of giants, warriors of unusual size, figures who seem to belong to another age. But the deeper implication may not be about physical giants at all. It may be about something more subtle, something woven into the fabric of human history. Because the Bible consistently describes humanity as living in a world influenced by both visible and invisible forces. Human choices matter, but spiritual realities also shape the course of events. The story of the sons of God reminds us that the biblical universe is not empty. It is layered, heaven and earth, seen and unseen, material and spiritual, and humanity exists right at the intersection of those realms, which makes the human story far more significant than it might appear. In the biblical narrative, humanity is not just another species struggling for survival. Human beings carry a role within a much larger drama, a drama involving freedom, rebellion, restoration, and destiny. The mystery of the sons of God hints at how easily that destiny could have been altered, how fragile the balance of creation can be, and how determined the biblical story is to preserve humanity's purpose despite that danger. But one final question remains. If Genesis 6 reveals a hidden chapter of the ancient world, why does the Bible mention it so briefly? Why only 4 verses? Why not explain the story in detail? Perhaps the answer lies in the way the Bible chooses to tell its story, because the focus of Scripture is never the giants themselves, nor the rebellious beings behind them. The focus is always humanity, our choices, our failures, and our hope for restoration. Which brings us to the final reflection of this mystery, one that reveals why this strange passage in Genesis still matters today. So we return to the original question. Who were the sons of God? The Bible never gives a single definitive answer. Some readers believe they were powerful human rulers who corrupted society. Others believe they were fallen angels who crossed a forbidden boundary between heaven and earth. And some believe the story is symbolic, a poetic description of the moment when human civilization began to drift away from its original purpose. The mystery remains open, but perhaps that is intentional, because the passage in Genesis is not written like a myth, it is written like a warning. 4 verses placed carefully in the story of the early world. 4 verses that appear right before the flood, as if the text is quietly saying something important, something about the fragility of creation, something about the danger of crossing boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. Throughout the Bible, the idea of boundaries appears again and again. Light separated from darkness, sea separated from land, humanity placed within creation as its caretaker. When those boundaries are respected, the world functions in harmony. But when they collapse, chaos follows. Genesis 6 may represent the most dramatic example of that collapse. A moment when the order of the world was disrupted, when forces from the unseen realm interfered with the human story, and the result was a world spiraling toward destruction. Yet the Bible does not end that story with despair. Instead, it introduces a new beginning. Noah survives. The flood recedes. Humanity begins again, which reveals something profound about the biblical narrative. Even when creation becomes corrupted, the story moves toward restoration. Even when chaos threatens to overwhelm the world, the possibility of renewal remains. The strange passage about the sons of God reminds us that the early chapters of Genesis are not merely simple origin stories. They hint at a universe far more complex than we often imagine. A universe where spiritual and physical realities intersect, where human choices carry cosmic significance, where unseen forces sometimes shape visible history. But the central question of the Bible is never about angels, giants, or ancient mysteries. It is about humanity, about what we choose to become. The story of the sons of God may be mysterious, but its deeper message is surprisingly clear. The human world was never meant to exist in isolation. We are part of a larger creation, a creation filled with order, meaning, and purpose. And the challenge of the biblical story is not simply to solve ancient mysteries, it is to understand our place within that larger design. Because if humanity truly bears the image of God, then the story of Genesis is not just about the distant past. It is about us, about the responsibility we carry, about the choices that shape the future of the world. And perhaps that is why the Bible leaves the mystery unresolved. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones that answer every question. They are the ones that leave us wondering, what really happened in those early days of the world? And what might it reveal about the unseen forces still shaping our own?